So I decided as my first Sunday out, I might tell you a little bit about myself. Some of you have read some about my life in the article, but then also talk a little bit about some of our Unitarian Universalist heritage. When we look at our lives, I think we find that they are often shaped or interpreted by the symbols that have meaning to us. Often the significance of these symbols, while representing our deepest held beliefs, change as we embrace life in new and different ways. Such has been the case for me as I claimed the chalice as a powerful symbol for my religious life, then rejected it, only to later reclaim it. But I'm getting ahead of myself in the story. As an adolescent, I discovered the church, or more precisely, the teachings of Jesus. I found peace and quiet in my local United Methodist Church. I found it to be a true sanctuary from the chaos of family and the social tremors of the civil rights movement beginning to reach even my small Mississippi Delta town. Once I committed myself to being a Christian, I totally focused on how Jesus called people to live their lives. Not in the sense of appropriate social decorum, which was rampant in my town, but I really sought to live according to the words of Jesus, to love my neighbor and to do good in the world. My family often reminded me that religion was nice, but I took it way too seriously. It gradually became clear that I didn't fit in my faith of origin. Like many of us who end up Unitarian Universalist, I asked too many questions. Almost a decade later, I was sure that my future was to be a United Methodist minister in North Mississippi. What's that old joke? You want to make God laugh, tell her what your plans are. And in one scenario for my life, I could have done that. But my heart and my mind weren't satisfied, even while I was in seminary at Emory. During seminary, I took a couple of pottery classes and decided to create chalices and plates to use for the bread and wine at communion. Creating those chalices was a very meaningful act to me because serving communion was both powerful and humbling. It was an expression of my faith and ministry. For me, the statement, "This is my body, this is my blood, which is given for you," affirmed life in the midst of tragedy and represented the core of my faith. But I began to ask myself if the words and rituals truly reflected the words of Jesus. Like many people, I sought to follow the teachings of Jesus, who affirmed all people who came to him, rather than the religion about Jesus. Jesus believed that faith was about love and blessing, not fear and condemnation. The Last Supper was not about the unworthiness of humanity. It was rather a Seder dinner where the story of Jesus' people was retold surrounded by those he loved. This story was not one about sin, but about endurance, hope, and love. As I explored my beliefs, I also learned from the well springs of wisdom found in other cultures and faith. I wanted to drink deeply from those well springs. Gradually, I found myself drifting away from the United Methodist Church. As was in the article, and some of you know, one of my childhood friends came out of the closet and was shunned by the faith that had nurtured both of us. The questions I'd been asking myself about spirituality then began to include questions about whether I could be a minister in a tradition that excluded people I loved. I wondered how a God, by whatever name we call her, who was all-loving, could reject anyone. Would not the sacred unity of all reality be great enough to offer love universally to all? And what about justice? Aren't we called to make the world a better place? Clearly, I was an inner mess. I became very confused about what I believed. Have any of you been at that place? I no longer had a framework for my faith. There I was, caught between a tradition that I loved, that had nurtured me and grounded my ethics, and whose tenets and rituals I could no longer affirm. So here was my faith of origin, and here was the unknown. I could no longer say the communion ritual that stated, "I am not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs from under thy table." If God were truly a loving parent, how could anyone be condemned? Wasn't love about original blessing, not original sin? It pained me to be so far from my faith, so I took the chalice, this is the actual chalice, that I had made to be a United Methodist minister, to use at communion, and I placed it at the back of the very top shelf of my kitchen cabinet. I'd come to ministry from a place of love and commitment, so where was I going to go now? I felt I was drifting with no grounding in religion, searching for a place where I could set down roots and be nurtured once again in a faith that spoke to my head and my heart. I found my state of being reflected in a poem by John O'Donohue. In out of the way places of the heart where your thoughts never think to wander, this beginning has been quietly forming, waiting until you were ready to emerge. For a long time, it has watched your desire, feeling the emptiness growing inside you, noticing how you willed yourself on, still unable to leave what you had outgrown. It watched you play with the seduction of safety and the gray promises that sameness whispered, heard the waves of turmoil rise and relent, wondered, would you always live like this? Then the delight, when your courage kindled and you stepped out onto new ground, your eyes young again with energy and dream, a path of plenitude opening before you. Though your destination is not yet clear, you can trust the promise of this opening. Unfurl yourself into the grace of beginning. That is at one with your life's desire. Awaken your spirit to adventure. Hold nothing back. Learn to find ease in risk. Soon you will be home in a new rhythm, for your soul senses the world that awaits you. So for years I lived in mystery, checking out different faith traditions, knowing there must be somewhere I could find a faith in a community that would be my spiritual home. Finally, a friend invited me to visit her UU congregation. I resisted, thinking, those people are weird. But my friend persisted in her invitations, and finally I showed up and realized I had come home. And there in the front of the sanctuary was another chalice with a different heritage and meaning. And I felt that this vessel was broad enough and deep enough to embrace all of my questions, all my searching, and all the people I love. I wondered how a symbol of suffering and redemption had been transformed into a symbol of life and love, a symbol of the quest for truth and meaning. Here was this a symbol that could embrace the whole human family and the wealth of spiritual wisdom? Yes, it was. I learned that following World War II, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee needed a symbol to place on vehicles so that people would know help was there for those suffering from the ravages of the Holocaust and war. The symbol of the chalice spread, and this morning chalices are being lit all over the world. But from where did that symbol originally arise? Was it time for me to reach up from the back of the cabinet and reclaim a symbol that had once been so important? What was the origin of this image that was so powerful to me? So my search led me to a radical Roman Catholic priest, John Hus, who was ordained a priest in 1401 in Prague. He wasn't much of an idealist and an unlikely candidate for giving us the symbol of our faith. Early on, he wrote to a friend saying, "I choose the office of priest because I have in mind a safe shelter and goodly apparel and a comfortable living." Sadly, he became a priest at a tumultuous time in the history of Western civilization and the Western Christian Church. He was appointed rector of the University of Prague and at Bethlehem Chapel, and in Hebrew, Bethlehem means house of bread. And this would be a place where people would be nourished by spiritual teachings in their own language. Now, this was pretty unheard of in his day, for the Mass was always said in Latin, which the common people couldn't understand. However, Huss believed that the words of Jesus were meant for all people. He was an enormous success, probably because he rarely preached on theological issues. He chose to preach on issues of life as he observed them. His belief was that if God had intended himself to be revealed through theology, we would all have been born with a doctorate. During this period of history, the university, and therefore the church Huss served, was controlled by the Roman Catholic Church. The problem at that time, as we know from history, was that there were two popes, one in Rome and one in France, both wanting control and tax monies. To resolve the schism, a third pope was elected. And as you use, we think we have tension and disagreements. To control dissension in the church, anyone who didn't comply with or who challenged church doctrine was excommunicated, and any offending books were burned. So even though John Huss wanted a simple life with goodly apparel, he loved his people and he loved his country too much to remain silent about his beliefs. Because of his actions and words, the Archbishop visited his congregation one morning to read the edict of Huss's excommunication. As the Archbishop stood at the altar and dramatically read the edict, members of Huss's congregation picked up the archbishop, robes, mitre, and all, and carried him out of the church, still proclaiming, and deposited him in the town square. So what was so horrendous that eventually Huss was burned at the stake and the church torn down? Well, in Huss's day, there was much political and societal conflict, with people predicting the end of the world. Sound familiar? Many believed that only the elect sons of God, emphasize sons, would be resurrected. The church held a position that no one in this life could tell who was the elect, and God would reveal that at the end of time. Imagine then the audacity of this man, John Huss, who preached that the elect of God were recognizable here on earth right now by the moral lives they led and the way they lived, the good that they did in the world. Huss believed, as Calvin did later, that it was moral men, no feminism in this age, who ought to be the rulers on the earth in preparation for the kingdom of God. Dangerous words. Even more damning was that Huss taught that the bread and wine at communion was not changed into the literal body and blood of Jesus, but was rather a symbolic act through which believers could join in the Last Supper of Jesus. In this belief, we see the coming of the Protestant Reformation. And contrary to the teachings of the church at that time, Huss believed that it was scripturally based to serve both the bread and wine at communion to all the people. Now, you need to remember that in the early 1400s, only the bread was served to the congregation. The church believed that the laity should not be served the wine because the consecrated wine, believed to be the literal blood of Christ, might be spilled by a clumsy layperson. Or the blood of Christ might come in contact with the beards of laymen. Clergy beards were okay because they had already been consecrated and they were exempt. Also, the church feared that the wine might freeze on very cold Sundays. And the final reason was that to pass out both the bread and wine would give lay people the idea that they were equal to the priests. And of course, it was this last argument that was precisely what Huss wanted to indicate, that all people, priest and layperson, are equal in the eyes of God. As I said, he was eventually burned at the stake for his beliefs, the first doctor of theology in European history to be martyred for his beliefs. This was almost a century before our forebear, Michael Servetus, was burned at the stake by the followers of John Calvin for his Unitarian writings. With John Huss's death, the flame of courage, the flame of freedom of thought joined symbolically the cup of our common humanity. They became the symbol for a great movement in Eastern Europe. The cup of communion, the symbol of respect for all people, and the flame of the search for freedom merged. Martin Luther adopted most of Huss's ideas and once remarked, "We are all Hussites without knowing it." Huss died for his beliefs and created a movement that in 1433 finally pushed the Roman Catholic Church to serve wine to all the people. There are many stories of how the commitment of John Huss inspired centuries of free thinkers. The symbol has been used for centuries in Eastern Europe when tyrants reigned and the people rebelled. The flaming chalice became an underground symbol, much as the fish was used by early Christians. The stories crossed to America, and our forebear, Theodore Parker, had the flaming chalice put on his gravestone. The rich and powerful history of this centuries-old symbol made it a meaningful and powerful choice for our historic faith. Now that I understood the meaning of our chalice, I realized that it transcended my former understanding of faith, and I could again claim a chalice as a symbol for my spiritual search. The chalice we light each Sunday, the symbol of our tradition, represents not only a modern understanding of wisdom, truth, and enlightenment, but also connects us to the lives and witness of centuries of the faithful, like John Huss, who spoke their truth and stayed the course of their faith journey in spite of the consequences. We have a heritage that speaks to courage and perseverance. So I now gladly claim the chalice as a symbol of my faith that affirms the inherent worth and dignity of all people. May the light of our faith burn brightly, a beacon for those who seek a place to search for truth and meaning. Amen.